Welcome to this edition of the Weekly Dialogues. Today, I'm going to talk about the second part of the distortions in the Indian history. In the first part, we had discussed the Marxist falsification of Indian history. Now, actually, we got a little ahead of ourselves because the Marxist distortion was taking further of the Western distortions which had crept in the previous century and a half. When the Western historians, when the first Western contacts began in India, the Western world was greatly impressed by India. It was so much impressed that it was called the era of romantics, the era of romanticization. The Western world suddenly realized that they had come into contact with a very, very advanced civilization. And especially when they started learning about Sanskrit, they realized that there were a lot of words that were common to Sanskrit and their own language. And the sophistication, the advancement, the sheer structure and the sheer science behind that language fascinated them so much that initially it was the Western world that proposed the out of India theory and also proposed that it was the Sanskrit language which was not only the common bridge between the East and the West, but actually the Western civilization had flowed from the East, gone to the West, and that is where the common bond rested. This was taken so seriously by the German scholars that the German scholars actually started calling themselves Aryans. See, the genesis of the word Aryans, where it begins. Now the pushback began in the West from the church. The church was absolutely alarmed at this development because they had taken care to study the Indian philosophy and they knew that the Indian philosophy came to dominate the West, then that would be the end of the church. The Renaissance was already on the horizon. I'm talking of the time around 15th, 16th, 17th century. And the Renaissance had in fact already begun in Europe. The church was being challenged from the Protestants, from the Enlightenment intellectuals, from a great Renaissance in arts, in science. In many ways, the church was under attack. In 1649, after the Treaty of Westphalia, the authority of the church was fundamentally diluted. Under these circumstances, what happened was that in the 18th century, the church began a pushback. And that pushback resulted in what is called the Aryan invasion theory, which is a totally unproved theory. It is based on that same theory of axiom on which the Western mathematics is based. We will discuss these science and mathematics problems or the distortions in the Indian science and mathematics in the third part of this falsification series. So, they brought in this Aryan invasion theory. The reasoning behind the Aryan invasion theory was very, very ambiguous. It was floated by Max Muller. The basis of this was linguistics. That same linguistics on the basis of which the earlier Jesuits and the earlier Romantics had proposed that their civilization owed so much to the East and that civilization had roots in the East. That same linguistics was made to upturn on its head, and that same linguistics was used to propose a new theory which said that basically the roots of Sanskrit lay in the West. Mind you, till date there is no authentication. So much so that for Aryan invasion theory in the Jaipur Dialogues, we have already announced a prize of rupees 2 crores for anyone who can come and prove conclusively this Aryan invasion theory. Till date, there isn't even a claim even though the price has been publicly announced. So, what were the four legs of this theory? Interestingly, this theory has these four legs, and even if you take out one leg, the whole theory collapses. The first leg is that there was an Aryan race originating around the Caucasus. The second leg was an arbitrary chronology that said that it happened around 1500 to 1900 BCE. Then there was another theory that was proposed within this sub-theory that said that there was an invasion by nomadic people who were speakers of the Sanskrit language. Now, let us deal with this one by one. The theory is that nomads invaded the northwestern part of India and brought with them a sophisticated language. So that gives us the paradox of an Indian civilization without literature, and a literature of great sophistication without civilization. Can you imagine nomads having a great civilization with a language of such great sophistication? Anyway, and the second one was, of course, that there was no invasion at all. At the time this theory was proposed, the archaeological excavations of Mohenjo-daro and Harappa had not happened. After the excavations, this invasion theory was conclusively thrown out. So, what the people who succeeded this, that is particularly the Marxists and others, whom we have discussed in the first part of this series, what they did was that they started forming another theory. They said that no, there was not actually an invasion, but what happened was an infiltration or migration. That's again interesting, that you have people migrating. The population of Central Asia, the entire Central Asia, from where these people are supposed to have migrated, was 1/100th of the Indian landmass. Now, this minuscule migration came and imposed upon such a great landmass, an alien language. Improbable, not just improbable, it's improbable, implausible, and actually impossible. Then the third proposition was about chronology, that said it happened about 1500, 1900 BCE. Why this chronology was proposed was again because of the church. Because the church chronology begins from the date, the biblical date of the creation is proposed. The biblical date of creation is 23rd February 4004 BCE. And the Noah's flood is supposed to have occurred at around 3000 BCE, and Noah is supposed to have lived for about 900 years. So anything that has to happen only after Noah is gone. Therefore, this date of 1500 to 1900 BCE. Now, this was the easiest thing to disprove, because as soon as it was discovered that the river Saraswati dried up around 1900 BCE, and it was proved that this civilization predated Saraswati, because Saraswati is extensively mentioned within the Rig Veda. Not just extensively mentioned, it is mentioned as a great river. Nadi Tame. Saraswati was a great river, not in 1900 BCE, but probably about 10,000 to 15,000 years back, or probably even earlier than that. So, that leg is also gone. So I have already demonstrated that 3 out of the 4 are gone, and the Aryan is not a race. It is only the Germans who tried to make it into a race, and that theory lies in smithereens today. All the 4 legs of this Aryan invasion theory have been demolished, but till date in India The Marxists continue with this lie, they continue with this falsehood, and we are still struggling to take them out from our textbooks, even though in the academia this has been conclusively disproved. Later on, all the archaeological evidences have come, the maritime evidence has come, even the genetic evidence on which they tried their fig leaf, the AIT exponents, even that has turned its back on them. Now the evidence of the horse, of the rats migrating out of India, with the agriculture, the rice evidence, the agriculture evidence, every evidence is now pointing not to the Aryan invasion theory but to the out of India theory, which was the original theory that the Romantics had proposed. So that is the first of the major distortions that the Westerners have done. With that, some of the evangelists in the south, they propose the Aryan-Dravidian divide. Now you understand this, that this Aryan-Dravidian divide is a totally artificial divide and it has its genesis in the Aryan invasion theory. If there is no Aryan invasion theory, then there is no Aryan-Dravidian divide. And there's also a very interesting theory how the evangelicals like Bishop Caldwell and Bishop Pope propagated it in South India. What they did was that they said that basically, according to the biblical race theory, which is called the Mosaic ethnology, there are supposed to be three races in this world. And those three races are basically Noah's three sons: Japheth, Shem, and Ham. So all the white Caucasian races are derived from Japheth. Then the Middle Eastern races like these Israelites, the Jews, and the Muslims, the Arabs, they are the offsprings of Shems. And rest of the world, especially the Africans, the blacks and the browns, are all sons of Ham. Ham was the cursed one, because Ham had actually laughed at the nakedness of Noah and the Noah had cursed him. All the brown and black races are cursed races, and it is the duty of the Japhetic races, the white races, to civilize the black and brown and also the sons of Shem. This anti-Semitism is basically the anti-feeling against the sons or the races which are based on Shem. This is how the biblical race theory is, and this race theory was propagated by Caldwell and Pope in Tamil Nadu. Tamil Nadu being a very, very deeply spiritual place, it did not succeed much, but it succeeded in Sri Lanka. That Sri Lanka crisis was entirely the making of the church. I think most people do not know that Prabhakaran was actually a Christian. They created this ethnology that Sinhalese are the Aryans and the Tamilians are the Dravidians. The church propagated this on the lines of what happened in Rwanda. There also the church did that. And having done that, they successfully created this divide and created the Tamil insurgency. And so many people, thousands of people were killed. And almost a permanent kind of a schism was created in Sri Lanka. In Tamil Nadu, it did not succeed, and with the Aryan invasion theory being demolished, it is unlikely that it will succeed. In fact, it is doomed to a failure. Whatever we see in Tamil Nadu happening now gives us great promise that this divisive theory is on its last legs even in Tamil Nadu. Then what they did was that they created an Indian chronology from which they took away a full 1500 years. I have already told you how they tried to fit their chronology into the Saraswati era. Everything was dated to 1500 BCE. So that means whatever has happened in Indian history has happened only after 1500 BCE. So Ramayana, Mahabharata, all the Vedas, Vedanta, everything has happened only within that window of 1500 years before Christ. Now, of course, we are debating right now on the date of Mahabharata. The date of Mahabharata, the debate right now is not on the 900, 1100 BCE date, but the debate is whether it is 7,000 years before or 5,000 years before. Nilesh Oak has proposed a theory where Mahabharata war has happened in the year 5546 BCE, and the Ramayana war has happened in the year 12,209 BCE. Whereas there is an opposing viewpoint which proposes that the Mahabharata war has happened in 3067 BCE. Of course, we know that our traditional calendar, the Kali calendar, begins 3102 BCE. That is supposed to be the date of departure of Bhagavan Krishna from this earth. Against this, the chronology proposed by the Westerners is quite absurd, and that is now being proved, especially after the discovery of the Saraswati basin dating through various scientific methods. It's now completely proved that the chronology that has been given to us is completely false. Then what they did was that they completely whitewashed Indian achievements in science, mathematics, architecture, metallurgy, shipbuilding, art and culture, linguistics, medicine and surgery, empire building. Some of our greatest empires are not mentioned in the history written by the Westerners. Urban planning, philosophy. The entire Sanskrit literature has been painted by the Westerners, especially the modern Westerners, those who came after the mid-18th, mid-19th century. They have projected is just some kind of a self-focused spiritual fool's paradise. We see that happening even today. People like Sheldon Pollock, people like Wendy Doniger, these people are there only to promote what is called academic Hindu phobia in the West. The internet and social media has now given us the hope. Internet and social media has now given us the tools to debunk these theories, and not just debunk these theories, but to take it to the masses. The masses which have been eating out of the hands of these Western historians, the Western intellectuals, the Western academia, are now getting to read and getting to learn the other and the more credible part of history from us. The Westerners also created a schism with Buddhism and Sikhism, keeping Sanatan on one part, and greatly alarmed by the assimilative qualities and properties of Sanatan, they tried to create a schism with Buddhism. Sheldon Pollock and Marxists are in the forefront of this, and they also employed a British civil servant by the name of Macauliffe to create this division between the Sanatanis and the Sikhs also. In the late 19th and early 20th century, if you look at the entire British shenanigan, it's all concentrated towards that. However, after the partition, things came on the right track, and Sikhs got completely integrated within the Indian mainstream. Otherwise, the effort was on this line only. That divisive philosophy was also reflected in what happened during the Bhindranwale years. After the Bhindranwale experience also, the practical Punjabis have got much wiser and there is complete peace on that account. Also, a false trope was created around caste. The jati in the Indian context has always been flexible on the Varna ladder. That has been the historical context. The endogamy within the jatis is a historical fact. Whether you consider it bad or good depends on your perspective, because jatis have had a great resistive effect against conversion. That is something that is the great contribution of the jati system, which cannot be ignored. When the first census took place in 1861, Lord Risley was the architect of that census. About 60-70% of the jatis did not know where they actually fitted in the Varna system. A great example is the Yadava jati, which in different areas is regarded differently. Somewhere it is Kshatriya, somewhere it is what is called cow herding caste or cow herding jati. I don't even like to use the word caste. It is a cow herding jati, and a number of dynasties in the south are all from the Yadava clan. Even if you read Mahabharata, I don't know whether you've read my books, but in my books I have clearly brought out that this is one particular jati, the Yadava jati, which has been moving on the Varna ladder up and down for millennia. William Jones, of course, was looking for laws in the sense of the Pentateuch of Bible. If you know the 5 major books which are considered as laws, Genesis, Exodus, Deuteronomy, all these 5 major books which are considered as laws. So it was quite inconceivable for someone like William Jones to come to India and not find the laws for the Hindus. And he dusted up one version of Manusmriti from somewhere, and he said, okay, I have found the laws for the Hindus. That's quite ridiculous. Smritis are only specific to the times that they are written in, and nobody gives them any kind of regard as sacred text. Manusmriti is not a sacred text at all. But he dusted up Manusmriti. Then the Westerners, they just lapped up Manusmriti. Wherever you go in the West, they will only talk about Manusmriti and caste. And when you tell them, I tell them, who reads Manusmriti? Who knows about Manusmriti? Nobody. I did a survey, online survey in northern India, and I found that out of 1,000 people whom I surveyed, 999 had Hanuman Chalisa in their house. Only 4 had Manusmriti, and all 4 of them were Marxists. So that is the kind of tropes that have been created by the Westerners. Then, of course, there is the actual issue of disregarding some of the major achievements and some of the major empires. Empires like the Karakota Empire. I don't know whether you heard of the Karakota Empire. The Karakota Empire is probably the greatest empire in terms of area after the Mauryas. There are certain disagreements about the extent, but it is often said that it actually extended from the Caspian Sea to the Bay of Bengal on one side and to the Rashtrakuta territory in the south, that is just on top of the Andhra Pradesh. So that would make it the second largest after the Maurya empires, probably greater than the empire of Akbar. But you will not find it mentioned anywhere. Then the greatest maritime empire, the Chola Empire, also one of the longest serving empires. The Chola Empire lasted for more than 1,000 years, but it hardly finds a mention. The Gurjar Pratiharas and the Ravals together kept the Arabs away. In fact, they chased the Arabs away. The Arabs have never conquered any part of India except for their brief foray in Sindh in the 8th century, early 8th century. After that, they were chased away and they never set foot back beyond the Indus. For 500 years, they could not come back. And when Mahmud Ghazni came here in 11th century, he was beaten back, and was not only beaten back, but somebody like what we call Suhail Dev, Raja Suhail Dev. He beat back the Salar Jung, his nephew, Mahmud Ghazanvi's nephew, and he was killed. But today some fools go and they put flowers on the mazar of Salar Jung in Bahraich, and that's a different matter, of course. We will deal with it later. The Vijayanagar Empire finds greater mention. The Vijayanagar Empire lasted longer than the Mughal Empire. The Mughal Empire, the first Mughal came in 1526 and stayed here only 5 years. The beginning of the Mughal Empire can be said to be 1556, the Second Battle of Panipat. And the decline of Mughal Empire was already in evidence by the end of the 18th century. By 1707, the Mughal dominance was over. Aurangzeb himself, when he died, was being chased all over the place by Queen Tarabai. The Marathas ruled this country for almost 100 years. But the Maratha Confederacy doesn't find a major chapter anywhere except in R.C. Majumdar's compilation, R.C. Majumdar's volume, where he has one full volume for the Maratha Confederacy. So that is the kind of distortions that the Westerners brought in, and this was gleefully lapped up by the Marxists that followed, which I have already discussed in the first part of this series. Now, to that, you add this background, and then you listen to these parts together, and then you will find that the history that we read today is actually a travesty. Not just a travesty, it's a tragedy. So this tragedy and travesty we have to get over with. In the third part, I will be dealing with the way the great Indian contribution in science and mathematics have been belittled and ignored by not just the Western historians, but also by the Marxist historians, the leading historian establishment, the leading history establishment in this country. Once we listen to all these three parts together, it is then that we will get the inspiration to undo this damage and bring in the actual, real, correct version of history. Thank you.
Press the bell icon on YouTube and don't miss another update.